So, are we filming? Are we good? When I was a kid, I learned that there are two options when you die. You can either go up or down. Now, I am not interested in any heaven other than the one that we create here in this life. So I'm going to be taking you all on a brief tour of the alternatives. What happens when we die and descend? And what can we learn from the worlds beneath our feet? Now, as Unitarian Universalists, we are the heirs to Universalist theology, which derives from the Christian doctrine of universal salvation. It has been about 200 years since our Universalist ancestors stopped believing in hell. If they stopped believing, though, that means that at one point they did believe in hell. So I propose that on our tour of the Underworld, we should start with the hell that our ancestors rejected, and we'll work our way back from there. Most modern ideas about hell, spelled H-E-L-L, that's going to be important later, come from the imagination of one Dante Alighieri. Born in Florence in 1265, possibly under the name Durante di Alighieri degli Alighieri, which I just like to say, Dante was a poet and a rebel. Instead of writing in Latin, the language of all respectable works, he wrote in his native Florentine dialect, inventing styles of lyric and verse that had never before been put to paper. Dante is best known for a poem that he simply called Commedia, which in today's world is sometimes called the single greatest work of the Italian language. In English, we call it the Divine Comedy, and it is most famous for its first part, the Inferno. Dante's poem describes hell in gleeful detail that had been thus far unknown to Catholicism, which again in 1200 was the only kind of Christianity. The Inferno is split into many sections which explore the 9 circles of hell. Dante paints a picture of hell that's sort of an upside-down, cone-shaped spiral, in which every circle is smaller, less populated, and deeper down. Up on the outskirts live the many millions of ordinary people who were simply never baptized, for example, the entire population of ancient Greece. Dante meets them all, it's a good poem. Whereas down in the bottom circle is Lucifer himself, eternally frozen in the icy lake that houses the sin of betrayal. In between are all the fiery pits and monsters that you've probably seen in cartoons before. Now, none of Dante's vision is, strictly speaking, biblical. Jesus himself very rarely spoke about an afterlife in any capacity, and when he did, he was more interested in the promise of heaven than the threat of hell. In fact, the New Testament does not contain any word that we would translate directly to the English word hell. Greek words like Hades or Tartarus are typically used to refer to an afterlife outside the kingdom of God. The idea of an unblissful after did not become common within early Christianity until many decades after Jesus was done preaching. Now, the Bible was not written in one setting. Books continued to be added, removed, and altered for centuries after the first Gospels were recorded. So it is not possible to pin down an idea of hell that is canonical in the Bible, because different authors had different ideas at different points in time that all made it into the book because there were no editors in the ancient world. The Book of Revelation, one of the latest additions to the biblical canon, implies that Satan is lurking underneath the earth with a horde of monsters waiting to be unleashed upon an unsuspecting and sinful humanity. Other authors seem to believe that Jesus was the only road to any kind of life after death, and non-believers just ceased to exist when they died. The earliest followers of Jesus, though, and Jesus himself, were Jewish. So they would have understood death through the lens of that religious tradition. There is a reason that Jesus didn't talk much about death and what came after. That just wasn't a very important part of his Jewish religious tradition. The Hebrew Bible, which modern Christians usually call the Old Testament, only mentions ideas about an afterlife in passing, and sometimes seemingly by accident. Very often when a character dies in the Hebrew Bible, the text simply reads, "and then he died." Another common phrase is, "he rested with his fathers." But see, resting with one's fathers is just a euphemism for a very literal state of affairs. Families that had the resources to make one in ancient Israel usually kept a family tomb, in which the bones of all of their ancestors were kept together. So to rest with one's fathers literally means to be laid to rest in the same tomb as your father and grandfather and grandmother and all of your cousins. But then, once in a blue moon, the Hebrew Bible mentions a place where the souls of the dead go. It's called Sheol. Sheol was sometimes thought to be literal and sometimes metaphorical. It was not a place of punishment, because everyone who died went there regardless of the life they lived. It wasn't a cosmic reward either. Sheol was dark and probably wet, because the ancient Jewish map of the world held that all of the land was held up by great stone pillars over an underground sea. This is the same sea that used to cover the entire world before God called the lands to form in the book of Genesis. One interpretation of the book is that a soul would rest with their fathers in the family tomb until their bones began to erode into dust, at which point they would no longer be tethered to this reality and they would slip down into the waiting darkness of Sheol. The souls of the dead then spent the rest of time drifting in the same dark primordial sea from which the world was first born. In death, they returned to the original source of life. All right, now try to imagine the Mediterranean Sea. It's shaped kind of like this. You've got Turkey big in the middle. Down here is ancient Israel, and right across the sea over here is ancient Greece. Now, thanks to the Roman Empire, ancient Greek culture and religion eventually spread all over the whole Mediterranean, which is why the Bible was originally written in Greek. And originally, the non-heaven place is referred to in the Bible as Hades. Looking at the proximity of ancient Israel to ancient Greece, though, it's not very surprising to notice that both Hades and Sheol had a lot in common before the Bible was anywhere close to being written. The ancient Greek underworld takes its name from the god who presided over it. Hades was the eldest of the gods, the first of 6 immortal children born to Rhea and her husband Kronos. Kronos' name is the basis of words like chronology, which means time. So Hades, god of the dead, the firstborn child of time itself, lives deep under the earth, ruling over a kingdom that houses every person who ever died. Depending on the lives they lived, they might spend their eternity in Elysium, the paradise of heroes, or Tartarus, the pit into which the gods banished monsters, or more often the fields of Asphodel, where those who did nothing to deserve either paradise or damnation just sort of wandered around together. Hades, it should be noted, does not rule this kingdom alone. He has a queen, Persephone. You all remember her. And Persephone is not exactly a goddess of death. Her mother, Demeter, is usually called the goddess of agriculture, but I think a better description would be to call Demeter the goddess of abundance. Demeter is the one who causes the field to give crops so that people can eat. But Demeter is also the one who decides when the crops will not grow. When Hades first saw Persephone, he stole her away, and her mother grieved so deeply that the world fell into its first winter. The sun would not warm the ground, the crops would not grow, and the people began to starve. Persephone, though, could not return to her mother because she had already eaten the food of the dead, and she could not leave the underworld. So a compromise was reached. Persephone now spends just part of the year in the underworld as its queen, and the rest in Olympus with her family. Every year, when Persephone descends into the underworld, the world falls into winter again, and when she returns to the living, the world bursts into spring. So the queen of the dead is the goddess of new life. Death, the first creation of time, rules side by side with the first breath of spring. All right, so we have now tracked our religious lineage, Unitarians, Universalists, hell, and hell back to its two conceptual parents, Sheol and Hades. But there is another branch of this family tree that has a more roundabout connection to our current day. See, we in this room, regardless of our different ancestries and backgrounds, are speaking English. And you may remember that there is no word in the Christian Bible that translates to the English word hell. And that's because the Bible was written in Greek, but we don't get the word hell from the Greeks, or from Latin or Hebrew. We get the word hell from a culture that we colloquially call Vikings. A more accurate term for them would be the Norse, or more broadly, the Germanic peoples of Western Europe. Both English and Old Norse are Germanic languages. They're cousins. The Anglo-Saxons, who are the first English speakers, left the mainland to colonize the British Isles starting around 500 AD-ish. They briefly became Christians while they were over there, and then they got reintroduced to Norse religion and language when they started getting raided by Scandinavian warships. Some of the Scandinavian raiders quite liked the British Isles. It is easier to grow things there than in Denmark. So they decided to stay and married into the Anglo-Saxon culture that would eventually become England. Now, it's hard to say when exactly we started using the word hell for the underworld. It may have been present in Anglo-Saxon Old English to begin with, or maybe it was brought to us from Scandinavia by Viking raiders turned husbands, but one thing we do know for sure. Hel, spelled H-E-L-L, comes from the name of a goddess, Hel, H-E-L. Hel is the daughter of two Jotnar, giants, but don't think giants like huge people. They're more like a race of magical, chaotic nature spirits. Hel's parents are Loki, the gender-fluid god of mischief and mayhem, and a mysterious giant called Angerboda. Hel's siblings are Fenris, the giant wolf who will one day swallow the moon, and Jormungandr, the giant snake who will one day swallow Thor. Loki kept Hel and her siblings a secret from the other gods for a long time. Probably because he was already married to a goddess named Sigyn, and he wasn't really supposed to be having monster children with Angerboda. When the gods finally did meet Hel, they were surprised to find a little girl in the company of a giant wolf and snake. When they looked closer, though, they realized that Hel herself had a somewhat frightening look about her. You see, on one half of her face Hell looks like any other healthy young person, with a flush of warmth in her cheek and sparkling eye. The other half, though, is the face of death. She's usually described as having the blue skin of a long dead corpse and an empty eye on one side. The gods gave her domain over the dead by her own choice. See, when living people saw Hell's face, they saw death and reacted with fear. But when the dead saw her face, they saw life and treated her with great respect. In Norse myth and religion, Odin gets first pick. He gets to sweep up the warriors who die in battle to join his army in Valhalla, but everybody else, especially those who have the good fortune to live into old age, are taken down under the ground. The underworld that takes its name from the goddess Hel is dark and quiet. The dead have a lot of time on their hands to reflect on what they did on Earth. Hel, the goddess, sometimes listens to their stories and tells them stories that she knows. All the dead are looked after by a woman who chose their company. The Hel of Norse myth is not ruled by a devil, but by a single goddess who is, in and of herself, the midpoint between life and death. So we see Sheol is connected to the same sea from which the world was first born. Hades, god of the dead, rules side by side with the goddess of springtime and new growth. Hell is life and death condensed into a single divine body. Every time that we venture down into the underworld, we find both the home of the dead and the cradle of life. Did you know that even Neanderthals buried their dead? How long have we known to plant our dead like seeds in the soil? If you pull up a diagram of our planet, you will see that most of our world is by mass metal and stone. Nothing grows in the inner core of solid iron, or in the outer core of molten iron, or in the magma of the mantle. Most of the Earth's crust is stone too, and it's packed too densely to let any roots penetrate. The layer of soil that can actually house terrestrial life is, by comparison, tiny. It's like a living membrane that covers most of the continents. Soil is different from normal rock. Soil is alive, teeming with microbes and fungal networks and tiny creatures that eat organic matter and break it down into its original building blocks: carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. These elements also make up the recommended healthy diet for almost all plant life. So up grow the grass and the trees from the elements in the soil, and in come the herbivores to eat their leaves, and in come the carnivores to eat the herbivores. And all along the way, when a living thing dies, it lays down where the soil can reclaim it and start the cycle again. Birth, life, death, rebirth, over and over, as far back as the first plants to take root on land. This balance by which death begets life is ancient and precarious. More than one human civilization has come to ruin by trying to take more from the soil than they gave, extracting too many crops without giving the soil time to rest and regenerate, demanding life without making an appropriate offering of death in return. More than one civilization has killed the land they lived on by placing things in the soil that they should not. Radiation and plastic and construction waste, things that never died and thus cannot be reclaimed to make life. The interconnected web of existence is not the same as the interconnected web of life. We don't leave the cycle when we die. And our most ancient relatives seem to have known this. A great many of them looked down at the ground beneath their feet and knew it as both the rightful home of the dead and the origin point of their lives. There can be no life without death, not because the old has to get out of the way to make room for the new, but because the old is what must become the new. The promise of rebirth is not a metaphorical platitude we tell each other to make us feel better. This is the most fundamental biological truth to which every carbon atom in our cells can testify. The soil is the underworld, constantly taking in what has died and transforming it into new growth, governed only by the law of balance. Beneath our feet dwell the true living gods of death, the mushrooms and beetles and invisibly small bacteria that choose to rule over the dark and damp cradle of rebirth. We would be very wise to treat them and their kingdom with the utmost respect. Now, beloveds, spring is upon us. Soon Persephone will return from the underworld, and Jesus will rise from his tomb, and the fields will be overtaken by dandelions. Remember that every blooming of new life is a gift from the underworld, where someday we must all go. Remember that every time you lie down where you can feel the ground beneath you, you are resting with your fathers and grandfathers and grandmothers and everyone who came before us. Let us therefore step lightly on this beautiful earth. She is the only home we have ever had. Since the carbon in our bodies was sound asleep in the ground, under the care of fungal gods, we have always been here, and we will always return again.